Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, March 8th, 2022. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior writer Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Associate editor Noah Rothman. Hi, Noah.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, having asked him 5 times to tell me his title, I've already forgotten it again. Our old friend Jonathan Schanzer of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where he is the senior
vice president
of research and author of the recent book Gaza Conflict 2021. His writings on the Gaza-Israel conflict have appeared in commentary, as well as many other writings about the Middle East. And we're thrilled to have him. We're going to talk a lot about the question of whether or not we are going to see the United States re-enter the JCPOA, the vaunted Iran deal, which is a bizarre set of circumstances that we have to discuss, given what we're going to discuss first, which is, of course, the continuing conflagration in Ukraine. So, Noah, as we enter into the third week, I mean, that's sort of, I'm not quite sure where we are in the timeline.
I don't even think it's been a week. Hang on, it's been 2 weeks.
Been
2 weeks on Wednesday.
2 weeks on Wednesday. Okay, so as we approach the entry of the third week of the actual hot war here, I think it is now fair to say what everybody has been intimating or hinting at, which is that militarily, this is a calamitous disaster for the Russians. That that march on Kiev, the encirclement of Kiev, whatever it is, has stalled out. The sabotage is working. Even conservative estimates of the kind of damage that the Ukrainians have done to the Russians is kind of staggering. The numbers of major pieces of military equipment, the number of casualties that the Russians have suffered, which again, the fog of war makes it very hard to get these numbers right. And at some point, someone was saying there were 60,000 Russian casualties, which is, of course, insane. But I mean, several thousand Russians have been dead or wounded in just a matter of a couple of weeks. That's pretty staggering. And the Ukrainian military successes, or whatever you want to call them, sabotage successes, are pretty stunning. This doesn't mean, again, that we have any reason to think that if the Russians bear down and just go at it hard, that they can't pummel Ukraine and the Ukrainians into some form of submission, at least surface submission. But this is a traditional thing for the Russians. They went into Finland in 1939, 1940, and got seriously bogged down in what was called the Winter War. They obviously got bogged down in Afghanistan. It's not as though they have an untrammeled history of success if there is sustained resistance. Where they have had success and where Putin has had success is in going into places where there really isn't resistance and then just rolling the tanks in and taking over, as really was the case in Crimea, for example. So is this heartening or frightening? For you, I would say the most worried for us about the possibility that this conflict is going to somehow escalate into something existentially dangerous beyond Ukraine and Russia.
Well, the best scenario from my perspective is for Russia to get bogged down in Ukraine. That would transform, what were already Europe's killing fields into a bloodletting. But that's essentially what we're seeing. What you just expressed, John, is a perfect encapsulation of how the commentary is around this thing, which is that the idea that Russia can crush Ukraine has been reduced to a throat-clearing perfunctory aside. Yeah, sure, Russians can do this. We just have no idea what they're doing. The information environment is dominated by Ukraine. We don't have accurate assessments of the Russian military advance, in part because Moscow's downplaying the intervention. So they don't broadcast their own successes, and we don't know them. And Moscow has 900,000 men at arms, and they can use them whenever they want. Blah 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 da 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 da. What you're seeing on the ground doesn't support any of this. So they're reduced to saying, well, eventually, of course, they have to win because they have to win. But what we're seeing is a stalled advance, a badly stalled advance, with the exception of a push from Sumy in the Russian border towards Kiev, which has been unopposed because the Ukrainians are falling back to population centers, as we've talked about ad nauseum for some time. The Russian advance in the north is largely stalled. It has become a war of attrition to a certain degree. We are beginning to see some long-range artillery and more use of Russian bombers, for example, strategic bombers. And we're also seeing a lot of losses because the air is still contested over Ukraine, even up to and including American assessments that Ukraine still has access to most of their fixed-wing aircraft. I don't actually know if that's true, because I think we'd see more movement in the air from Ukrainian forces. Nevertheless, I say much of the Ukrainian regular army is still intact. We are not at a stage at which we're talking about an insurgency. There is still command and control in place, albeit in a broken way. The advance in the south is a little bit more effective, but it is similarly stalling out around Mykolaiv. They've surrounded Mariupol, they've surrounded Kharkiv, they're crushing Kharkiv, although that can still be resupplied. Mariupol is fully surrounded. And we're just beginning to see what people who study Russian military doctrine expect, which is the absolute decimation of population centers in a way that is contemptuous of modern pieties. Just bringing back Stalingrad, essentially, in places like Mariupol and Kharkiv, where people can, not many reporters can get in, but when they do get in, they see quite a lot of horrific devastation. The most conservative Western estimates, you can't trust anything coming out of the ministries of defense of Ukraine or Russia because they are at war. The nation that is honest about its enemy casualties in wartime has yet to be found. But a very conservative Western assessment is that roughly 3,000 Russians have died. It's in combat. It's likely much larger than that, although we're not sure how much larger than that. But that's already the extent of the casualties that the United States, more than the casualties the United States suffered in the entire Iraq War campaign, including the pacification and insurgency and surge and half a dozen other developments over the course of the 15 years we were there conducting combat operations. So yeah, to say that this is a debacle for the Russian military, I think is absolutely fair. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, overly sanguine, but we are seeing to a shocking degree the extent to which Ukrainians not only have the will and capacity to resist, but that they are executing very effective asymmetric operations against this force in a way that's degrading their capacity to secure strategic objectives. That's exactly what we want.
Jonathan Schanzer, you are an expert in asymmetrical warfare. It's one of the subjects you have been writing about for decades, and with a particular focus on Israel and the Palestinians and conflicts in Lebanon and elsewhere. I mean, this is not just asymmetrical warfare usually refers to, the circumstance in which you have an overwhelmingly dominating military and a kind of rear guard force and action that does what it can to hamper it. Ukraine has a functioning military. That's the thing that I think we haven't quite. I mean, that's Noah, as you said, we are, the United States is saying that Ukraine still maintains an air force. That is something that the Russians were not able to eliminate. The first thing that we did going into the Gulf twice, Iraq both times, the evening that we started the war was to take out their air force. We flew over, and we destroyed hundreds of planes on the first night in 1991 and on the first night in 2003. And basically denied them any ability to strike us from the air, which is, I think, what everybody assumed. That's like War 101 that the Russians would do, and they didn't. We don't quite know why they didn't. We don't understand the circumstances of this, but the fact that they have an existing military that, like, be fair is fair. Like, they've spent 8 years doing war games, preparing for this invasion, and apparently with some degree of success. So
yeah, I'll just say this, that it's amazing that certain elements of Ukraine's military still exist. You would think that the Russians would have planned this better. You would think that the Russians would have softened the ground, so to speak, before going in, making it effectively a cakewalk. I think this war has revealed the deep flaws in the Russian military. And by the way, we're seeing even reports right now of generals that are coming to the front to try to urge on the fighters who are beginning to flag. I mean, you can get a sense that the resolve of the Russian military is beginning to lose some steam. And so generals are going to the front, and there have been reports of a number of very senior Russians getting killed on those front lines. And these are things that are just unthinkable when you think about the way that the United States has conducted its wars. So I'm shocked by this in a pleasant way. I still don't have a whole lot of hope for the Ukrainians holding out long term. I think that has been the assessment of most of the military analysts that I've talked to. But one other interesting thing to note is just, when does mud become a factor? When that does become a factor, you could actually begin to see the slowing of the supply lines. You could see Russian vehicles actually just getting, limited to paved roads, which then, of course, makes them extremely vulnerable to additional asymmetric attacks by the Ukrainian military. This thing could go on for quite some time, and I do think that it's probably good news because, I think the general assessment anyway is that Putin has eyes for territory beyond Ukraine. So if he can be slowed here, then that is a net positive. It's also, by the way, very positive when one considers the fact that the Chinese are eyeing this as well, wondering what an attack on Taiwan might look like. The only thing that really bothers me is that it looked like the US-led world order is being upheld not by the US, but by a ragtag determined group of Ukrainian fighters. And this just does not sit well with me.
Can I point out, Noah, you mentioned Stalingrad, and of course, the interesting thing about Stalingrad, this is Stalingrad in reverse. Stalingrad was a Nazi advance on a major Soviet population center, and they were pinned down for 16 months in the siege by the Soviets, who did what you've talked about on this, which is that they retreated to the city, they sacrificed territory for time, and they just grinded out misery for the advancing Nazis until 16 months of hell were experienced by the Russians living in Stalingrad and living through the siege. But they never relented, and this is the Russian myth. This is the great Russian myth of the 20th and 21st centuries. The heroism of Stalingrad, the refusal to allow this invading army to get any further, to show that Napoleon lost when he advanced into Russia, and the Nazis were going to lose advancing into Russia, and that they would do what was necessary to defend their motherland. And here they are, and Kiev could be their Stalingrad. They walked themselves, Putin, who uses the Stalingrad analogy all the time to talk about the immense suffering of the unique suffering of the Russians in World War II and how they saved the planet from the Nazis, largely in Stalingrad, has now maybe created a Stalingrad of his own, in which he is the bad guy.
When you talk about asymmetrical warfare, I think there's one of the key asymmetries here is kind of an unexpected one, which is morale, right? On the two sides. I mean, as we've said and noted, the Ukrainians have just been extraordinary in their commitment and their courage, and this is what they're living for at the moment, to defend their homeland. And report again, you have to take these reports with a grain of salt, but there are reports of captured Russian soldiers saying they feel duped at having to invade and under the circumstances in which they did. And there's also a sense of desperation on the Russian side. these things like importing Syrian fighters into Ukraine. So there's a lot of asymmetries here, not just in the sort of the way we normally talk about asymmetrical warfare.
I would add that in the propaganda war, and it likely is, much of this is propaganda, so should be taken as you say, Abe, with a grain of salt. The getting the Russian moms on social media scolding Putin, that one I like. I like the Russian mothers who have sons fighting this, saying, "How dare you? You told us this was a training exercise." That's actually weirdly very powerful for the Westerners sitting on the sidelines, thinking, "Well, we don't want to get involved in war." To hear the moms,
yeah, Westerners, Russians will never see it. There is no free information environment in Moscow anymore. There's no independent media. There's no social media, so you cannot rely on the Russian street to do the work for you. It's not going to happen. Russia has demonstrated a willingness to absorb a reputational cost here that should absolutely terrify everyone, in part because they're running a Syrian playbook. We've seen these humanitarian corridors that are open for a minute, only to be, according to the International Red Cross, mined or hit with their artillery, which is very Syria. Now they're talking about actually observing these humanitarian corridors and appear to be doing so, which is even more ominous than just bombing them directly, because if it's the Aleppo Homs playbook, you allow for this period to evacuate civilians and declare every single person in the city a combatant and go ahead and level the place. And we've talked about, Kharkiv has been impossible to secure, and this is on the steppe, and we're talking about a flat plain. Kiev is a city full of hills. 45-degree hills. It's full of caves and chasms, very deep subways. It's the sort of place that could be defended for a very, very long time in an asymmetric way. And if Russia decides to do this for the next 4 or 5 months, which is perfectly envisionable, I think, if you have any imagination, then yeah, we're talking about a scale of destruction on the European continent akin to what we saw in Syria, in a way that will further shock the minds of Europe, that we, in a way that we haven't even seen already. The amount of the reaction has been intense and horrified and has been appropriate. We haven't seen anything. They
are also, they're targeting Western media now pretty directly. We've had several reports just over the last 48 hours. There was a Swiss reporter who, they very clearly marked as press on their vehicles and on their clothing, and they're being shot at directly by the army. Again, an attempt to intimidate any sort of media that might feed into Europe and to the US even. They're targeting, that's
the biggest
actually
problem is that the analysts who expect the Russian advance to eventually succeed only by virtue of throwing meat into the grinder, a la Stalingrad, is that they haven't threaded the needle where we get from 500,000 men at arms, or sorry, 250,000 men at arms in Ukraine to 500,000 men at arms. We have to get there in order to pacify this place. And it's just sort of assumed. No one ever goes to the point at which Moscow actually orders the draw up of all these forces out of the periphery, out of the east, out of Central Asia, literally leaving just about every border in Russia rather, undefended. I mean, that's what Russia would have to do in order to see this campaign through to the end. And I haven't seen many military strategists grapple with that reality, because it is existential from Russia's perspective.
See, I want to go back to this asymmetrical war, this bizarre, maybe unprecedented circumstance. And again, Jonathan, this is where I would turn to you, of a successful asymmetrical warfare program in tandem with an extant military capacity, a conventional military capacity, in the form of men in uniform who have trained extensively and how to do X, Y, and Z, and fixed wing aircraft and other sorts of things, combined with sabotage, whatever it is, darting in and out, as you say, the asymmetrical warfare possibilities on a paved road. I mean, we've already seen that. It's one of the reasons that the advance of the convoy halted, and where I sort of give myself weird credit, simply not as a military strategist, but as somebody like watching things on television, seeing that convoy and thinking, this seems stupid. Like, they're on this one road. Even I could figure out how to flatten 200 tires, and I can barely operate a toaster. You flatten a tire of a giant truck, it's 2 hours to change the tires of the truck, and you slow everything down behind it. So do you know of a sort of analog? I mean, if you think about Israel's difficulty with asymmetrical warfare in the past, whole point about it is that they've had relatively total command of the territory in which they are being attacked from, right? I mean, this is West Bank, not Gaza, fair enough, but West Bank during the Intifada, and all the Intifada existed because the Palestinians had no normal military capacity of any sort. So all they had was asymmetrical warfare, and they managed it reasonably brilliantly until the Israelis then used their own advantage, geographical, military, and a material advantage to kind of wear it down and hunt and peck and search and root out bomb factories and things like that, and then essentially end the Second Intifada.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I'm actually more interested right now in looking at Hezbollah in particular. This is a more of a hybrid force, one that engages in those asymmetric type attacks, while also maintaining what is akin to a modern military. In some ways, Hezbollah has actually got more military capacity than a lot of European armies. And what I think is interesting is that both in the Hezbollah and Hamas context, they have fought Israel to a tie repeatedly. We see it all the time. I mean, Israel will claim that it has achieved all of its military objectives, but they're not trying to go in. They don't want to reoccupy southern Lebanon or the Gaza Strip. And also, the Israelis are constrained by their own morality, right? They could turn Gaza into a parking lot. They could turn southern Lebanon or the Bekaa Valley into a parking lot. And I think this is what I'm watching for right now with the Russians. I don't believe that Putin will find himself to be constrained in the way that the Israelis have in the past, where they're willing to fight to a tie and to allow for a quiet front for another couple of years. That's always been the goal for Israel, is just fight to at least quiet things down and to neutralize their enemy. For Putin, this is, of course, a war of aggression. This is a war of conquest. And so, I mean, there are some similarities, but that is the big difference. And I just wonder what Putin will do next.
So we are apparently, as we're recording, the Biden White House is preparing for Biden to come out and announce full embargo on Russian oil products. Which is interesting because we get to this point about these sanctions, which was, if you're going to levy them, why didn't you shock and awe the sanctions at the beginning? And I think it shows that just how fast this is moving, that they really thought that they would have the sanctions that they had in place. Biden said, give it a month, we'll see how it's going. And that the need to strike hard and to keep going and to kind of continue to strangle the Russian economy, or like tighten the strangulation of the Russian economy, outdistanced their capacity to see that they were going to do this eventually. And either that's fine, because now it'll happen, and with all the attendant pain that it's going to cause there and here. I just wonder about the effect. The polling numbers are astonishing, right? Something like 70 to 80% of Americans say they're willing to suffer higher prices at the gas pump if we were to embargo Russian petroleum products. I mean, I gassed up on Sunday night and in New Jersey, which is classically a relatively low priced gas state.
Oh, you haven't tuned in since the Christie years. We've sacrificed the
still,
social compact here, where we have very high property taxes and no gas tax, and in the Christie years they imposed a gas tax. So the social covenant is broken in New Jersey.
It's still considerably lower than New York State, and it was $4.20 a gallon, and that was before all of this started. So, I mean, we're going to see $5-6 a gallon in a matter of days, if not more. These are numbers we've never seen before. I mean,
yeah, it's not just at the gas pump. What we really rely on is like 3% of our oil we get from Russia. What we really rely on are petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, gas blended stocks. So most of it goes to the Pacific Northwest out of Vladivostok. So yeah, we're going to have significant logistical problems in this country, to say nothing of price increases. And the administration is very short-sighted, if it thinks that this patriotic fervor will last into the next 3-4 months, especially
I don't know
with the
what
summer
they
driving
didn't.
season.
They clearly didn't want to do it.
No, well,
They
they
didn't
wanted
want
to
to
do
do
it.
it, and they have been.
If they did want to do it, they wanted to do it in concert with our allies to a certain degree. We just simply can't because our allies are so dependent on gas from, and particularly natural gas from Russia, which is why we should have been preparing for this many, many years ago.
Look, the stagflation of the 1970s was 75% of it was due to oil shocks, 73 and 79. I mean, after the 79 oil embargo, we got to 18% inflation in the United States. Like, we're at 7 now, or 7.5 now. God knows where it goes. And remember, a lot of that is also perceptual. Like, as you say, we only get 3% of our gas, or sort of are at the pump gas this way, but that's not gonna matter when it comes to public panics and worries about supplies and what
Briefly,
kind of pricing is
JP
gonna
Morgan
be.
estimates that we could be at about $185 a barrel by the end of 2022 if this continues. It's roughly about 150 now, which is a record price. And the estimate is that for every $10 per barrel increase in oil prices, inflation in the US rises by 0.2%.
Right. I mean,
which is
to
a full,
be
so
fair,
basically a full
the history.
percent.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the history of oil panics and the prices of I mean, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that number is the highest in, like, in numerical terms, but I mean, we were at over $100 a barrel in the late 70s at the time of the oil, at the time of the second oil embargo. And that was over 45 years ago or whatever.
But adjust for inflation, John. If you adjust for
That's what I'm
inflation,
saying.
these aren't the highest
Yeah,
prices we've ever experienced. And people are like, well, wait a minute.
No,
That's
no,
actually the problem.
we are in for, I mean, I don't think it's the patriotic fervor. I think, again, it's a weird thing, which is that there are some things that are worse than more direct military involvement. I understand what you're, and now we get back into the point about whether or not we can even dare to do military involvement. But, you do all this and there's a kind of worldwide economic effect, most of which is related to needing to be tough and trying to strangle Putin's efforts here in the cradle. But the ancillary consequences, are going to be very severe for a very long time. And it's a question of what the trade-off is, whether there was other stuff that could have been done. We look at, we say we can't do a no-fly zone. That's part of war, right? Now we're in a shooting war with Russia, which I don't think is exactly true. And I'm not saying that, because they have a nuke, we can't do that. I know that's the general argument, but if the world economy goes through a colossal spasm, way more painful than we even have begun to contemplate, I don't really know whether or not you're going to look back at this and say, it wouldn't have been better had we, taken more conventional methods, including, like, shipping American planes and handing them to the Ukrainians, which, we're not even talking about doing, right? We're talking about getting Polish planes to the Ukrainians and other kinds of planes. And I don't know. Let me go to a break, and then we want to talk about Iran. So obviously this is a very stressful moment for the world and for everybody. I think we were hoping that our stress level was going to decrease as the pandemic period came to an end, but it's not really the case. And so if you're feeling stressed in a way that you didn't expect to feel stressed, it's time to start thinking about Headspace. Headspace is an app scientifically proven to help you manage your feelings and your mental health. In fact, a recent study proved in just 2 weeks, Headspace can reduce your stress by 14%. Whether you want to relieve stress and anxiety, sleep better, or improve your focus, Headspace is your everyday dose of mindfulness for real life. Once you download the Headspace app and try their mindfulness routines, it takes just a few minutes a day to change your relationship with stress and anxiety, to start feeling better, from waking up happier to getting your mind ready for bed. Make 2022 the year you incorporate mindfulness into your daily life and change your mental health for the better. However you're feeling, try Headspace at headspace.com/commentary and get 1 month free of their entire mindfulness library. This is the best Headspace offer available, so go to headspace.com/commentary today headspace.com/commentary. And we're hearing all this stuff about the Russians closing down people's access to the internet, and so we're thinking about this a lot. But you may want to do something about closing down access to the internet, your internet, and the materials that you have on the internet from hackers. And that's why you want to look at ExpressVPN, because every time you connect to an unencrypted network in a cafe, a hotel, an airport, any hacker on the same network can gain access to your personal data. It doesn't take much technical knowledge to hack someone, just some cheap hardware is needed. A smart 12-year-old could do it. So if you use ExpressVPN, here's what you get. You get an encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet. Hackers won't be able to steal your sensitive data. It would take a hacker with a supercomputer over 1 billion years to get past ExpressVPN's encryption. You fire up the app. It's so easy to use. You click one button, you get protected, and it works on all devices, phones, laptops, tablets. So secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/commentary. That's expressvpn.com/commentary. And you can get an extra 3 months free. expressvpn.com/commentary. Jonathan Shanzer, what are the oddities of our present moment? We've been sitting here waiting for a year as Biden promised during his campaign, and as he decided he needed to fulfill his campaign promise, that we are going to re-enter. I guess that's the term that they're using, although obviously it's going to be a completely different deal. Re-enter the JCPOA, the Iran deal that was struck in 2015 that Donald Trump pulled us out of in 2017, 2018?
18.
In 2018.
18.
Okay. We're a lot of us are shaking our head. First of all, we're shaking our heads at the whole notion of doing this, and we should go into that. But we're particularly shaking our heads because the key player in the Iran deal, aside from the United States and Iran, is Russia, right? In what way, if you could lay out for people, what role would Russia play in the renewal of the Iran deal for the United States and for Iran?
Sure. So, I mean, the Russians have been the key mediator. As you probably know, the United States is not in direct talks with Iran. It's indirect. So they're shuttling back and forth in Vienna. And the key player is Mikhail Ulyanov. And he's Putin's envoy to Vienna. And he's the one who continues to come up with compromises. I'll put those in air quotes, because those are the things that he suggests basically upon Iranian these are Iranian ideas, and he'll present them to the United States. The United States invariably accepts these compromises, has not stood firm. So the deal continues to be a lopsided one. Massive sanctions relief that is going to Iran, at least from what we understand right now. And this is all being facilitated by the Russians. The Russians are also right now looking for a carve-out. Now, Blinken has balked at this for the moment, but they're very desperate for a deal. This carve-out would effectively mean that Russia would be able to continue to trade with Iran, even as it comes under massive sanctions from the West right now, that they would still have the ability to work with Iran. And of course, the Iranians are masters at money laundering, moving money around the world for rogue states. So this could be a way for Russia to continue to bring in money, even as the US sanctions tighten. So it's really confusing that this would be the case. I think that at the end of the day, people have asked, well, why would Russia want to do this for Iran? On the one hand, the Russians and the Iranians they're working together in Syria, but they're also a bit at odds. They're not entirely on the same page. They also see themselves as competitors in some shape or form in that part of the world. But I believe that Russia understands that ultimately a strengthened Iran, and perhaps even a nuclear armed Iran, would ultimately undermine the US-led world order, and that is in their interests. But I think beyond that, they now see themselves as being directly involved in a major multinational deal at a moment when they're supposed to be isolated, and they see this carve out for themselves. So I think they've played the United States masterfully. The Biden administration, not a shock to me, but they've welcomed the Russians to the table, and I think they've got played.
As did the Obama administration, but get played by the Russians in Syria.
Correct.
So what we have here is a classic asymmetry, which is to say that we clearly want to install, or the United States, clearly government, well, the United States wants to re-enter a deal with Iran, and that's significantly less important to Iran than it is to us. So the question is, what do they get for acceding to our desire? That seems to be the largest. And Richard Goldberg, your colleague at FDD, has sort of systematically gone through, like, it's they're going to get access to $100 billion, I guess, in not quite. It's not quite the same as they got the 150 billion back that we had been keeping.
Right, not cash, but sanctions relief. And by the way, that's significant, because when they get this money right now, their accessible cash reserves, which is the major metric that all of the sanctions geeks look at, right? That there was roughly $4 billion accessible to the Iranians at the height of the Trump era sanctions. This is going to go back up to about $100 billion, which means they'll be able to buy whatever they need to in cash in the arms market. They'll be able to support terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, the Houthis, et cetera. But it's more than that, because right now it looks like we're going to relax sanctions on the IRGC, which is their primary tool for terrorism sponsorship around the world. We're going to relax sanctions on the Supreme Leader, which has a massive slush fund that is thrown around for nuclear as well as terrorism means. We're going to see sanctions relief on the worst human rights abusers. These are people that have carried out war crimes abroad in places like Syria and Yemen, but also have been torturing people at home. So we're completely capitulating on that. In another year, you're going to see the end of the restrictions on ballistic missile projects in Iran, which means they are going to legally have the means to deliver a nuclear weapon in a very short amount of time. So this kind of negates everything that we're trying to do in terms of restricting Iran's nuclear program. But I'll give you two other things that we're watching that really bother me right now. There's a lot of pressure on the International Atomic Energy Agency to close the files on Iran's previous nuclear activity. In other words, they just want the international, this is the Biden administration, asking the IAEA to just look the other way on what we know Iran has already been doing. These files are open for a reason. This is nuclear mendacity, if you will. And there is a deliberate attempt by the Biden administration to paper all of this over. But the last thing, and these are reports out of Iran right now, and so we need to be very careful about what we accept as truth. But this has been echoed by other folks that we've talked to in the region. The Biden administration looks to be set to offer the Iranians what is being called an inherent guarantee. So this basically means that in the future, Democrat or Republican administrations may decide that Iran's not upholding its end of the deal. If they pull out, Iran has a legal ability pursuant to this deal to begin to enrich uranium at much higher levels and to install advanced centrifuges. So in other words, this administration appears to be taking the side of Iran in future disagreements before they even know what future administrations may have a problem with. And the insanity of this, I can't tell you, I've never seen anything like this in any deal, in any international diplomatic arrangement. This is beyond bizarre. So this looks like a full capitulation by the Biden administration.
Well, let's go to that last point first. So that seems very specific to a specific thing that happened in 2015, which is that seems to be some kind of prospective effort to block the letter, a kind of letter of the sort that Tom Cotton wrote to the Supreme Leader of Iran, in which he said, I just want you to understand the way America works. You can do whatever you want here. We have political change in the United States. A new administration can come in and it can change the policy. So don't think that, you're going to get away scot-free here. And there was an enormous hue and cry about how one of 100 senators, representative of Arkansas, was somehow interfering with American foreign policy simply because he had written a commonsensical letter expressing a proper view that if this JCPOA was not going to be submitted to the Senate as a treaty and therefore be permanently binding on the United States, that it was simply an expression of administration policy, and that a future administration could, and as happened, did revoke it or change it. This letter is some kind of promise to Iran that that won't happen again to Iran, a kind of effort to prospectively tie the hands of American officials and campaign people and Republican politicians from expressing their views, and saying properly that these agreements, they are set in stone if they are submitted to the Senate as a treaty and passed by a 2/3 majority, as treaties are passed by 2/3 majorities. Failing that, they are not binding on future administrations or indeed on the present administration, and they're somehow going to get around that by issuing this proclamation, which is kind of startling.
There is absolutely the political context, which I think you've laid out very well, but you also have to understand here that what they're doing is they're guaranteeing nuclear advancements, things that never would have been allowed. They're basically saying right now in advance, you can do these things. This would have been beyond the pale for the non-proliferation community a few short years ago. And now they're saying, go right ahead. You can install football fields worth of advanced centrifuges, which will allow you to get to that breakout time that much quicker. And we're doing this to make sure that somebody like Donald Trump won't be able to get out of the deal quickly as he did last time without thinking twice. In other words, they're taking the side of Iran over America. And that is insane.
There's also there's something here that's actually been part of a broader strategy on the left lately, and that the Biden administration has clearly embraced both domestically and in foreign policy. And that's when the democratic system doesn't do what you want, you find ways around it, whether it's executive orders, because you know you'll never get something passed through Congress, whether it's we don't like that the Supreme Court is more conservative leaning now, so let's pack it with more people, let's add states. It's a weird kind of way of saying, our system has, the beauty of our system is the fact that every 4 years we can toss one guy or gal out and put someone else in who can change everything up. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. They are trying to institutionalize things that are anti-democratic at their core, so that future leaders who the public wants to see, who are put into office to initiate change, whether it's in foreign policy or domestic policy, have their hands tied. And then when the public says, why are we in this? Aren't we worried about a nuclear Iran? You can just imagine the Jen Psaki briefing. Well, we have an international order. We have a non-proliferation agreements. They'll cite the very things that they're actually trying to undermine to justify not doing anything.
We have interesting political crosscurrents within the Biden administration, or within this negotiating team, the American negotiating team. 2 months ago, I believe, one of the lead American negotiators, Richard Nephew, quit the effort, which is a sort of unprecedented thing to do. And he quit, and he said, I'm leaving because I have substantive disagreements with the way that the administration is proceeding on this matter, the negotiating team being led by Robert Malley, who was a leading NSC official in the Obama administration. That's pretty startling also. Like, I'm not sure that I remember a resignation on principle in the middle of a very, very complicated, negotiation like this. Again, were this the Trump administration and such a thing had happened in a Trump negotiation, Richard Nephew would be one of the most famous people in the United States, instead of being someone you haven't heard of until I mentioned him just now, even though he has a very interesting and memorable name. So that's one thing. But I wanted to ask, as a devil's advocate thing or something like that. So imagine, Jonathan Schanzer, that you are you are Robert Malley. And you have to face a skeptical person, I don't know, Robert Menendez, Senator Menendez, or somebody like that, somebody who is deeply skeptical of what you are doing here, but is somebody who is in your camp and you can't just dismiss as being some kind of a Republican plant. How do you make your case for why this is a good thing outside of Biden said he would go back into the JCPOA during the campaign? He has to fulfill his campaign promise. Can you think of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, look, the argument is one that has become sort of binary, and you hear the Israelis talk about this all the time with their U.S. counterparts. The difference is you can legitimize right now the Iranian gains that have been made, and then try to enforce some measure of transparency on a state sponsor of terrorism that holds nothing but disdain for the United States and is likely to obfuscate every move that they make from here on out. And that would be the major critique of the deal that we're getting into. What the Israelis would like to do instead, and what I think a lot of Iran hawks here in the United States, Arab countries as well, UAE, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, which would be to isolate the Iranians politically, isolate them economically, put immense pressure on them, and watch their nuclear program like a hawk, with the threat of military force if they try to break out or sneak out. This is what they would like to do instead. But Malley will say, look, we know that this is a bad regime, or I'm not sure exactly that's how he would describe it, but we need to try to keep them transparent. We need to keep this nuclear program in a box. Right? We need to contain it, and we need them to be as forthcoming as possible. The problem, I think, is that this box is made out of cardboard. Maybe there's no bottom to it. Maybe it's a jack in a box, right? We're not looking at a regime in Iran that is going to allow itself to be restrained. We've already seen the last time around, after the deal was signed, that there were things that they were hiding from the West. There were things that were hiding from the IAEA. We should not expect them to be honest about their intentions or their current progress on the nuclear front. And that's essentially the discrepancy here. If this was a more responsible nation, a more transparent country, not the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, maybe they would have an argument. I don't think they have one now.
I think it's worth tying this to the first half of our discussion today. In light of the somewhat sotto voce nuclear blackmail to which the Putin has subjected the world right now, isn't there a really important lesson here to learn about dictatorial regimes and their promises, particularly around things like weapons of mass destruction and the relative benefits of diplomacy versus hard power, and maybe let's not let anyone else get into this position and be serious about it, not just put them in a cardboard box.
Look, you're making an incredibly important point in three respects. One of them is that we have no right to be surprised by Putin's actions, right? Why? Because he told us, he's been telling us for 10 years or longer than that this is what he wanted to do. He wants to reintegrate or integrate Ukraine into Russia. And we didn't believe him. China says it wants to take Taiwan. A lot of people just simply don't believe it. They think it's just lip service. And Iran says it wants to obliterate Israel. The only country in the world that really takes Iran's threat to obliterate Israel seriously is Israel. And so the question going forward is, these are dictatorial regimes hungry for power, who have old-fashioned ideas about power and the exercise of power. And as Matt Continetti says in a forthcoming piece for Commentary, maybe we should believe what they say and therefore act accordingly. Take them at their word, because they're not bullshitters. Jonathan.
I think there's something, this is a profound point, but I would even take it a step further. The big mistake that I believe the United States has made repeatedly over recent decades, I mean, you could really take this back to the 1970s, in the outreach to China, and then after that, the way in which we've tried to welcome the Russians into the US-led world order, or whatever we're calling it. And now we're trying to do it to Iran. This idea that somehow access to our systems, access to cash, access to credit, access to political legitimacy will somehow transform these rogue states and these autocrats and these dictators and these murderous people. And we continue to delude ourselves that this is in fact possible. It continues to happen here, and we're doing it with Iran, even though I think, Putin has disproved this, Xi Jinping has disproved this, and yet here we are trying to do it again. This is Lucy in the football. It's truly insane what the Biden administration has deluded itself into thinking.
But I also wanted to add another point about what you said about, Putin's nuclear blackmail. We can see in historical terms that the gigantic mistake that was made here historically, if you look at the present circumstance, was Ukraine giving up its nuclear deterrent in 1994 in exchange for a promise at Amsterdam that we in the West would make sure that what is happening to Ukraine right now wouldn't happen. That's not a treaty. It's not binding, really. It's a declaration of principles. But if you are now a country on Earth, what you want to do, the idea of what has gone on, the failure of our deterrent against Putin would lead you to think that every country in the world should now have a galloping nuclear proliferation problem. Because one of the ways to stymie any effort to control or contain your behavior, if you're a bad actor, is to have a nuke. So Iran, that's very important for Iran. And then, of course, we have the real reason that for 20 years almost, people have been talking about doing something about the Iranian nuclear program and making sure that it didn't happen, because this deal is struck. And the real issue is, what does Saudi Arabia do? What does Egypt do? What do these countries do when they are existentially threatened, as Israel is, by Iran? Saudi Arabia not going to try to get a nuke now? Oh, of course it's going to try to, if this happens. Now, the last point here is, we're talking about this as though this thing can happen with the Soviet Russians as the guarantor or the mediator, and we're about to destroy Russia's economy. Today, some point in the next hour as I'm speaking, we're going to make an announcement that we are destroying Russia's export economy.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do here is to get Russia to negotiate against itself in this deal, because one of the advantages, chiefly, the Russia crisis didn't precipitate this. On February 9, you had Senator Chris Murphy emerging from classified briefings, telling reporters, look, they're weeks away from a breakout. They have enough nuclear fuel to make a bomb if they want to. So it's not as though the Russia crisis precipitated this. The Russia crisis has heightened our need to get Iranian oil back on the market, escrow, wherever the funds go for escrow or otherwise, but just get it on the market to relieve this pressure. They're also mounting counteroffensives, energy counteroffensives, trying to reintegrate Venezuela into the community of nations just to get this done too. But we need Russia to take their nuclear fuel, right, in order to get Iranian oil on the market. Well, Russia's reportedly stalling now a little bit because they benefit from high prices. They don't want to flood the market with Iranian oil. They need all the revenue they can possibly generate from Russian energy exports. So now we're in a place where we need Russia to do something that is no longer in their interest.
I mean, the contradictions and manifold bizarreries of the fact that we entered into this negotiation in the way that we did. I mean, let's put it this way: even if you think that it was a mistake to pull out of the Iran deal in 2018, the way we pulled out of the Iran deal, and I mean, there's an argument there, I suppose. But it just became axiomatic in the Democratic primaries that, if Trump did X, then you did not X, and everything he did, you were going to reverse every single thing. And what we ended up doing was, imposing these sanctions a year later, particularly after Soleimani, the head of the, basically the leading terrorist in the world, was taken out. Was to do this thing where we choked off their reserves, and we made sure that they no longer had any money, as Jonathan, as you laid out. And why that's bad, even from the Biden perspective, I'm a little at a loss as to understand why the resulting fact that we put these sanctions on, what it is that you look at there as Tony Blinken and say, boy, that's really bad what Trump did there. We gotta stop that, because the Iranians really need a lot more access to capital so that they can buy weapons we don't want them to have and build centrifuges we don't want them to build.
Look, they're still trying to prove a theory, which is that Iran, if given access to capital, if allowed into diplomacy with the West, welcomed as a legitimate member of the community of nations, that they're willing to do the right thing, that they're willing to keep their nuclear program contained and to work with the international community. That's what the theory is. It's never been proven. I still believe to this day that keeping pressure on Iran while negotiating would be the right thing to do. Somehow this has escaped the Biden administration. But look, more than anything right now, you could have argued 3 months ago, 5 months ago, look, we need to keep working on this Iran deal. This is the only crisis that we need to face. If we just put this in a box now, we can pivot to Asia. I mean, that was kind of the thinking here in Washington just a few short months ago. Since the invasion of Ukraine, everything is turned on its head. Right? The United States is about to make concessions to Putin through this deal. That should not be happening. We have to figure out how to thread the needle here. And I don't think that coughing up concession after concession to the Iranians is the way to do this. The world is now watching.
I just wonder if this can happen. It's like, absent what happened over the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think it was inevitable that we would go back into the idea that today of all days, I mean, the story last week was today was going to be the day that they would announce the return to the Iran deal. And instead they're announcing that we are banning all Russian petroleum products. I don't understand how you make this next announcement that says, we have this fantastic deal that the Russians are the third, or the third leg of the stool on. I don't understand it.
It's even harder, I think, now, John, if you think about, the collapse that we had in Afghanistan, the overall erosion of American power projection as this entire thing unfolds. And then you say, oh, and by the way, we have great news. We're going to be giving $100 billion to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Look at how American diplomacy is working. It's just unthinkable now.
I agree with that as a matter of law. I'm literally talking about, like, right now, this week, today, we're about to go. Basically, we're doing everything short of dropping bombs on Moscow.
Well, the spin.
And then it just doesn't follow logically that even Biden, who bizarrely doesn't follow logic often, can turn around and then announce the return to the JCPOA with Russia as a key player.
The spin coming out of certain media sources that are sympathetic to the Biden administration and to a new nuclear deal with Iran is that this is what we need to do because the world needs Iranian energy sources now, energy resources now.
Good luck. There's that, and this bizarre thing where they went to Venezuela, a Russian vassal state, the only country on earth that was supporting Venezuela, is that in Cuba, the only country supporting Venezuela in its efforts to crush, to have Maduro re-steal the election and survive the punishing sanctions placed on Venezuela in the wake of its horrendous that regime's horrendous conduct. We're now going to negotiate with Venezuela. I mean, again, there's a kind of illogic going on. It's like the Biden people, half of them are like, we're in a new world, and half of them are like, let's pretend like we're in the Carter administration, which I really don't think is a good model, but nonetheless, you could I don't think it's a good model, but they do. I mean, they like a lot of things that happened there. So I don't know. Jonathan Shanzer, thank you so much for joining us and being so illuminating. Gaza Conflict 2021 still available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Kindle and wherever you want to find it. And we will be back with you tomorrow. For Abe, Christina, Noah, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.